for 50 cents. The night my Amber introduced me to hers my younger one. That was it. No name, no job. Just my younger one, the way you'd mention a piece of furniture that came with the house. My sister got, "This is Renata, she just made partner at Whitmore and Associates." Full name. My full title, eye contact. I got my younger one. I was 31 years old, running a company with 42 employees, and my mother couldn't be bothered to say my name. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My sister is 4 years older than me. 50 cents. Her name is Renata, and I say her name because she deserves to have it. Said, she worked hard. She built something real, and none of what happened between us was ever really her fault. The fault, if we're being honest, started much earlier than that, 2012. And my parents sat us both down after my science fair win, and my father said, "Your sister has always had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Try not to rub it in." I had just won. I was 12. And my first lesson was, dim yourself down so no one feels bad. I learned that lesson, well. I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, the kind of suburb where the houses all have Spanish tile roofs and everyone drives the same 3-car models in slightly different shades of silver. My father spent 30 years in commercial real estate, 50 cents. My mother was the kind of woman who organized charity galas and knew everyone's business, and wore her hair in a perfect blonde bob that she'd had since 1987. They were not cruel people, exactly. They were the kind of people who confused love with pride, and pride caught with performance. And so when Renata made partner at a law firm and figuring things out, the math in their heads was simple. Renata, success. Minata, ? Season. What they didn't know, what I had very deliberately not told them, was that 2 years earlier, I had co-founded a company called Meridian Talent, a boutique recruiting firm specializing in placing executives in the nonprofit and social impact sector, Phoenix. We started with 4 people in Phoenix. By the time my mother called me my younger one in front of her book club friends, we had offices in Phoenix, Denver, and Austin. We had placed over 300 executives, with funding healthcare foundations in the country and one of the largest healthcare foundations in the country. And, well, I hadn't told them because, honestly, I'd tried. The first time I mentioned the company, my father said, "Recruiting? Like a headhunter? That sounds unstable." My mother asked if I had benefits, 50 cents. Provided the benefits. She said, "Well, that's good then, I suppose," and changed the subject to Renata's new condo in Arcadia. After that, I stopped trying. Not out of spite, or not only out of spite. Partly because I'd learned at age 12 to dim myself down. Partly because I was busy, and partly because there was a small, stubborn part of me that thought, someday they'll ask. Someday they'll be curious enough to actually ask. They never did. The wedding invitation came in February. I was getting married in May. A Saturday outdoor ceremony at a resort in Sedona, the kind of place with terracotta walls and desert sage everywhere, and views of the red rocks that make you believe in things, 50 cents. Her fiancé's name is Warren, and Warren is a genuinely good man who had been devoted to my sister for 6 years, and who, every single time he saw me, asked real questions and listened to the real answers. I liked Warren. I was happy for them. The invitation listed me under the family seating arrangement. I was at table 9. My sister's in-laws were at table 2, right next to the family table. My parents were table 1. Renata's law partners were at table 3, which my mother had specifically arranged because, as she told me on the phone, it's important for her network to feel celebrated. Table 9 was near the catering station. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Fixed D. I RSVP'd, yes, bought a dress, booked a hotel room in Sedona, and told myself it didn't matter. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called to go over logistics. She needed me to arrive early to help set up the welcome table. She needed me to make sure the out-of-town guests knew where to park. She needed me the shuttle from the hotel. She said, and I wrote this down because I couldn't believe it afterward. You don't have as much going on as Renata right now, so you're the logical choice. I had a board meeting that morning. Done. I canceled it, rescheduled it for a Tuesday to direct parking logistics for my sister's wedding. I want to be clear. I would have done all of that anyway, happily, because I love my sister. That part wasn't the wound. The wound was the assumption, the absolute confidence. My mother said, you don't have as much going on. Not a question, not a check-in, a declaration. She had looked at my life and decided without asking that it was small. I set up the welcome table. I coordinated the shuttle, 50 Ds. I smiled, and I barely knew and answered questions about where the restrooms were. And the family photos were being organized. My mother positioned me at the edge of the frame, next to my aunt's husband who I had met exactly twice, while Renata and Warren stood center with my parents. I stayed at the edge of the frame. I had been at the edge of the frame my whole life. I was used to it. What I was not used to was what happened at dinner, 50 cents. I was seated at table 9, as assigned, between my mother's college roommate's daughter, a woman named Blythe who was perfectly pleasant and worked in pharmaceutical sales, and an empty chair that turned out to belong to a man named Clifford, Warren's former business school professor, and slightly out of breath and immediately began telling Blythe about a conference he'd just flown in from. I introduced myself to Clifford. He shook my hand, said, "Lovely to meet you," and turned back to Blythe. This is a normal thing that happens at weddings. I did not take it personally, What happened next was not normal. Clifford was talking about the conference, something about impact investing, nonprofit sector trends, executive leadership pipelines. And I found myself listening because this was, in fact, my professional world. I knew the conference he was describing. I knew 2 of the panelists, my husband. I had been invited to moderate one of the sessions but had declined because of the wedding. At a certain point, I said, "Is that the Philanthropy Leadership Forum? In Chicago? I know Judith Adler from that circuit. She spoke on the executive pipeline panel." Clifford stopped mid-sentence. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. "You know Judith Adler. We've worked together a few times. She's placed 3 of her foundation's VP-level hires through my firm." Silence. Brief but significant. "I'm sorry," Clifford said, and he had the particular expression of a person rapidly recalibrating. What firm?" "Meridian Talent. We do executive search in the social impact space." He put his water glass down. "Meridian Talent," he said slowly. The Meridian Talent that placed the COO at the Carter Foundation last fall. That was us. And the partnership director at the Education Initiative in Dallas. The one that got written up in the Chronicle of Philanthropy in January? Also us. Clifford looked at me for a long moment. For Ress, he had The specific expression of a man who has been next to someone important for 20 minutes and talked about himself the entire time. "You're the founder," he said. Not a question, a realization. I said, "Yes, yes, Smy." And then, because Clifford was a professor and had spent decades in rooms with people, he did something my parents had never done. He turned in his chair to face me fully. He said, "Tell me how you built it." So I told him. For me. I told him about the coffee shop office placement we made, a development director for a food bank in Tempe, and how we'd almost lost our first big contract because our software crashed the night before a client presentation. And my co-founder and I stayed up until 4 in the morning, rebuilding the deck by hand, 50 cents. I told him about the Denver expansion and the Austin office and the Healthcare Foundation contract and the thing I was most proud of, which was our retention rate. 84% of the executives we placed were still in their roles 3 years later, which was almost unheard of in the industry. 50. Clifford listened to all of it. He asked follow-up questions, real ones. I didn't notice how loud our conversation had gotten until I looked up and realized the people at table 8 had gone quiet. And then I noticed my mother, for Adins. She was standing near the edge of the dinner area, champagne, glass in hand, mid-conversation with someone from my father's side of the family. She was looking at me, or rather, she was looking at the door here at Clifford leaning forward, at the two people from table 8 who had drifted over, at the fact that a small, attentive cluster had formed around a person she had described 2 weeks ago as not having much going on. I watched her face, fifth. I had expected, maybe, embarrassment, a flicker of it, at least. A tiny internal acknowledgement that perhaps she had made some incorrect assumptions. What I saw instead was something more complicated. It was the face of a person who has organized the world in a specific way for a very long time, and is watching something in that organization fail to hold. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something that looked more like the floor shifting. She walked over, Sinaned. She said, with her best social smile. Clifford said, "Did you know your daughter founded Meridian Talent? I've been citing their methodology in my graduate seminars for the last 18 months. My mother opened her mouth. Then she closed it for 50 cents. She looked at me, and for the first time in my adult life, she was looking at me the way she looked at Renata. Not with warmth. Not yet, that would take longer. But with the particular arrested attention of someone who has walked past a painting 100 times and only just now noticed what it actually is. I didn't realize, she said finally. I didn't know the scale. You never asked, I said. I didn't say it with anger. I genuinely wasn't angry in that moment. I was just tired that is different from regulars, tired, the kind of tired that settles in after years of waiting for a question that never came. I said it the way you state a fact, because it was one. She didn't have an answer for that. My father appeared from somewhere behind her. He'd clearly caught the tail end of it because he said, "Were rates," he said. "Warren's professor was just telling us about your company?" Clifford said helpfully. "Right, Clifford. He says you've done quite well." I looked at my father, 50 cents. He is a man who spent his career in commercial real estate and understood instinctively the language of deals and scale and quiet power. And I could see him doing the math in his head. The kind of math he did with square footage and lease rates, and getting a number he had not expected, he said. "Healthcare Foundation contract," I said, We signed it in Novistrate. Exclusive executive search partnership. Which foundation? My father said. I told him. He knew it. Of course he knew it. Everyone in Arizona who worked in any adjacent industry knew it. Friesbent. Healthcare's foundations in the Southwest. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You should have told us. And there it was. Not I'm sorry we never asked. Not I should have paid more attention. You should have responsibility, even now, redirected back toward me, toward my failure to perform my success loudly enough for them to notice. I thought about saying that. I thought about explaining it, calmly and clearly, the way I explained things in board meetings. I thought about walking them through the 12 years of evidence. Every dinner conversation about Renata's cases, every phone call still that ended with my mother asking what I was still doing with the job stuff. Every birthday where the gift was subtly smaller, the hug slightly shorter. The attention already moving on. Instead, I said, You're right. I should have been clearer. And I let them have that. Because Renata's wedding was not the place, and because my father is 72 years old, and because some battles you simply choose not to fight on someone else's happiest day. But I felt, for the first time in a very long time, that I had somewhere to stand, not because of the contract or the offices or the number of employees. I had never needed their validation for any of that. I had built the company without their encouragement, and I had kept building it without their interest, and it had grown exactly as it was going to grow, independent of whether they ever noticed. I felt it because of the look on Clifford's face when he said, You're the founder. Not sepsis. The recognition, them. My sister found me after dessert. She had seen it. The cluster at table 9, my parents' faces, all of it. And she came to find me out on the terrace, where I was standing with a glass of white wine and looking out at the red rocks in the dark, which are still there even when you can't see them. I didn't know, she said, about how big it had gotten. That's not okay, she said, that I didn't know. And that was the thing about my sister. She had always been this, direct and honest and unwilling to let herself off the hook. Whatever shape our family had pressed her into, she was still, underneath it, a fundamentally decent person who had spent her career arguing for fairness and actually believed it. I didn't make it easy to know, I said. You shouldn't have had to. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not upset, I tried to find the word. Tired. My sister nodded. She understood tired. We had different versions of it. Hers was the tired of being expected to be perfect. Mine was the tired of being expected to be invisible. But we recognized each other's in the way that siblings do. Warren knows, she said, about your firm. He'd seen something online about the foundation consent contract. I think something like, I said something, oh, that's cool, and moved on. She shook her head. I'm sorry, I should have said more than that. It's fine, I said, huff. And then, because it was her wedding day, and she was trying. Really, it's fine. We stood there for a while, looking at the dark where the red rocks were. The months after the wedding were strange. My mother called more frequently. She asked actual questions. About the company, about the foundation contract, about the Denver office. The questions were sometimes slightly off, slightly fumbling. The way questions are when you're learning a language you should have started years ago. But she was asking. That was new. 50. My father mentioned my company at his golf club. I know because one of his friends reached out through LinkedIn to ask if Meridian Talent did work in the private sector. And when I responded saying we specialized in social impact, he wrote back, "Your dad talks about you all the time. You should be proud." I read that message 4 times. I don't think my father had ever talked about me at his golf club before, but I'm also not wrong. Things did not transform overnight. That is not how families work, and it would be dishonest to tell you it was. It's Bitsy Sen. My mother still sometimes leads with Renata. My father still sometimes frames my work as the recruiting thing. There are years of habit in them, and habits don't dissolve in a single evening in Sedona, no matter how clarifying that evening might be. But something shifted. Some small tectonic thing, below the surface, that changes how everything above it sits. Last Thanksgiving, we drove out to my parents' house. Renata and Warren, me, my aunt and her husband, the usual constellation, Sesame. My mother made her standing rib roast, which she has made every Thanksgiving for 28 years, and which is genuinely one of the best things I have ever eaten. My father opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving, Fesen. And at some point during dinner, my father turned to me and said, "Tell them about the Chicago project." We were expanding. A new contract, a major workforce development initiative on the south side of Chicago, the largest thing we'd taken on. I had been working on it for 8 months, Fitney. It was, honestly, the thing I was proudest of in my professional life, I told them. My aunt asked questions. Warren asked questions. My mother asked a question about the nonprofit sector that was actually quite perceptive. "Wait, how many executives have you placed total now?" And when I told her, she said, "Oh my God," with genuine surprise and laughed a little and reached across the table and put her hand on my arm. My father listened to all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 2 words. Not a speech, not a formal apology or a reckoning or a scene. Just 2 words, said plainly, the way my father says things he means. I almost said, "Thank you," and moved on. Instead, I said, "I know." Not to be cold, not as a point scored. I said it because it was true. And because I had spent 31 years waiting for permission to know it, and the permission, it turned out, had always been mine to give. My father looked at me for a moment. Then, slowly, he smiled, wide, and slightly crooked, and I have always loved it even when I was too angry at him to admit it. He smiled that smile and raised his glass a little in my direction and said nothing more, and I raised mine back. That was enough. After everything, that was enough, I say. It wasn't, not fully, maybe not ever. But because I finally understood something I had been trying to understand whole life. The table I belonged at was never the one they assigned me. I had built my own table. 42 people sat at it, 50 cents. It stretched from Phoenix to Denver to Austin, and soon to Chicago. And anyone who wanted to join it would have to do the one thing my parents had never quite managed. They'd have to ask,